Does my voice sound raspy?
A bit. Why, you
Does
get
my
coming down with a
voice
cold
sound
or something?
raspy?
It's like, you
Does my
sound
voice?
like you sound like RFK Jr.
Wow, that's Fauci. I have allergies or something, or I just lost my voice. But I am going to sound like RFK Jr. Let me see the MR. Hopefully it clears up. All right. What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, my friend? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. We were just talking about an interesting topic off the record, and it's interesting. So we figured we'd just hit record. It's an interesting story, but Danny and I were just talking about how, or times when the CIA or intelligence agencies have infiltrated organized religion for some type of political aim. And Danny was like, "Well, I was reading. Well, why don't you just say what the example you
Yeah,
used?"
and I was doing a little reading. I came across an article that pretty convincingly laid out the case that in South America, the CIA basically propped up evangelical Christianity to combat communism and socialism, which is pretty interesting. And apparently, it worked so well that it got re-imported into the United States, which is just kind of fascinating to read about. And I asked Henry if he had any interest in that, and then we just kind of went on a little side tangent of like, hey, this is not the only time that the CIA has potentially co-opted a religion for some geopolitical aim.
I have a funny story. So, I mean, intelligence agencies co-opt religions all the time. They've co-opted every single religion at one point or another, including Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But I have a very specific example. So Catholicism was used as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. And I've actually learned about this from my pre-Cana teacher. So pre-Cana is like a course that you take before you're about to get married in the Catholic Church. So my pre-Cana teacher was he worked for the State Department, and he got a job in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, working with the Pope.
Okay, that's cool.
So he lived in Budapest while it was still part of the Soviet Union, and he organized protests. And the types of protests that he would organize, they weren't violent, were flash
were they
mob
paid?
protests. They were flash mob protests.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what he did. He would get a group of people, and they would just start dancing in the middle of the street. And he organized, when he was introducing himself, he's like, "So, some things about me. I am the Guinness World Record holder of the largest Macarena."
Wow.
So one of the protests that he did was that he organized a giant Macarena dance in Hungary, and it was a way to show like, hey, you can't stop the wet Western culture from seeping into the Soviet Union. Everyone join in. Look how fun it is to be part of the West. So he worked directly with John Paul, Pope John Paul II, and he was like kind of an intermediary between the State Department and the Vatican. And he would go and he would organize protests in the Soviet Union. So intelligence agencies do it with every religion. There's not one. If it's possible, they'll do it.
Yeah, I mean it's clear that that's something that they do, but I don't know. I just found it interesting just chatting with you about it. Like there are so many examples of that. I think you called out like the Dalai Lama potentially being like a CIA asset or CIA adjacent in some way. I was like, I hadn't thought about that. There's plenty of other ways, that they've done it too. And I find the topic super interesting. Might have to dig into it a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we can put into it. But I mean, religion is something that's important to people. So it's something that you can rally people behind. That's why they do it. It's also, religion kind of fits in the same field as nationalism as well. So
Sure.
There's reasons why they do it. But
I
we're
wonder
not
if the
talking
CIA
about that
has
today.
infiltrated sports teams in the same way.
Yeah, it's possible. But we're not talking about that today. Today, we're actually doing an episode that is long overdue. So it is April 2nd at 10:06 p.m. as of right now. So who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. If you are listening to this a year from now, and you discovered this podcast in kind of the wreckage of New York or Puerto Rico after the war comes here, then this is the circumstances that we were in. But we are in week 4 of the Iran-U.S. war, right? Week 4?
Yeah.
Or above that. We're almost at 30 days, I believe. And doesn't look good. Doesn't look good. So the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. And now seems to be a more than likely chance that there's going to be a ground invasion. Hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. But
I think it's so crazy that it's hard for me to believe it. So maybe it's like a big feint or negotiation tactic. But certainly, like, all the signals are there that this is going to happen. And the people I've talked to in the military are saying, "Hey, this is going to happen." It's hard for me to believe it, honestly. Like I can't actually see it happening. But
I mean, we've been talking about a potential conflict with Iran for literal years, and it always seemed like this kind of like hypothetical, what if, blah blah blah. And now that it's actually unfolding, it's actually like way more ridiculous than I thought it would ever be. Like in every sense of the word, you know. The only way that it's better than what I anticipated is that the death toll isn't super high, which is good.
And
that's the only way that I'm pleased about it.
It's a miracle that we've only had 15 casualties, which are horrible deaths. At the same time.
Deaths.
Yeah,
casualties
15 KIAs, which is absolutely terrible. But you would think that there would have been more by now. And I'm not one of the people who believes the U.S. is covering up KIAs. That would be very hard to do in this country. I think I think a lot of the wounded are getting just lost in the news cycle rather than it being lied about or there being some type of deception.
I definitely think they're downplaying the severity of some of the wounded for sure. I definitely think you're going to have a lot of people that are coming home with, life-changing injuries.
Yeah.
100%. And that's a tragedy in and of itself. But I mean, every model, every scenario, every expert that we've covered or, studied on the particular topic is always made it seem like this is going to be the bloodiest conflict ever. And in many ways, this war is a little bit different in the way that it's being played out than what a lot of the experts were, originally thinking. This is much more of a standoff war than obviously it's not boots on the ground yet, but if we start putting human beings on the ground in Iran, even on Karg Island, I think that changes the calculus quite a bit. And we've got opinions, but I don't know if I'm ready to express them. I don't know, because you never know.
Yeah, dude, it's wild. It's hard to believe that this administration exists in our reality. It's like something out of a parody.
Yep,
it's like a film parody.
Feels like it.
Like doing a satire on this administration.
It's kind of a Simpsons episode.
Yeah.
It's
an episode of The Simpsons.
Yeah. Kind of feels like that.
It's crazy just between the characters that they have. Trump looks like he's actually melting. If you see him talk, he looks like he's melting.
Mm-hmm.
So
he really does. Yeah.
It's weird, but we're not going to get too much into the weeds of the current situation, just because there's so much going on, and I'm kind of sick and tired of going on, like logging into Twitter and seeing everyone's takes, like, oh, well, Iran's missile production rate has gone down by 10%, but they've actually been saving their missiles for, just 10%. Like, I just, kind of over that right now.
Yeah.
It's like, the interceptor rate has been degraded by 20%. So now 90% of missiles are getting through Tel Aviv. And the fact that it's like, okay, just tell me, be concise. Just what's happening, good or bad? Good.
Yeah.
Are we good or is it bad?
It's not great.
Just give me a scale From on a 1 to 5 scale, like do it by smiley face to like very sad face and say where we're at.
It's kind of like,
Not like, well, the perception.
It's one rung under the neutral face. I feel like that's my take.
It's like the one exactly, but it could turn into the very sad face.
It could, yeah, very quickly,
very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to talk about the history because obviously, like, there's a lot of debate. Well, there's not that much debate. I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. and Israel this is a joint operation, and
by many accounts, that Israel was the reason why we got it in the first place. So
yeah. So I wanted to talk about really the history of relations between Israel and Persia, because I think if we just talk about it, and this is not going to be the entire history of every single thing that happened between the two states, because that would be impossible to do.
You forgot about the 1300s.
Yeah,
we're not gonna talk about the 1300s.
I want to talk about it at a high level, just to provide some context of what Iranian policy and what Israeli policy, how it evolved over the years, and why it evolved, how it changed just due to different circumstances, and maybe it will give some context into why these two countries are so hostile to each other now. Because you would think the way that, like, Benjamin Nitton talks about the Iranians, does he call them Alamak, or is that something that is only referred for Palestinians?
I don't know. I think he might have at some point. It's hard to keep track of all the. The Persians aren't Amalek. No,
they're not. Okay, they're not declared at all. So. That's just the Arabs.
I think so. Yeah, I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it's just the Arabs.
Well, Jews and Persians have coexisted for thousands of years. Jews have lived in Persia since ancient times, and when the Jews lived in Persia, they lived under comparatively tolerant conditions. So the Babylonian Empire, they destroyed Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE, and they deported a large segment of the Jewish population, mainly the elites and the skilled workers, to settlements across Mesopotamia, particularly along the Euphrates. And they did this mainly to separate Judah with its high human capital and also to gain productive workers. They were not slaves, but they lived in designated communities, and they performed, important services in these settlements. And over time, these exiles became rooted. Now, when the Persians conquered Babylon, Cyrus, he issued a general decree allowing the Jews to return back to their ancestral lands and restore their temples. Many of the Jews did return, which, would form the Second Temple community, but many others did not. So after decades in Mesopotamia, they had their families and their commercial ties. Persian rule was tolerant, so many actually voluntarily settled across different provinces in the Persian Empire. Since then, for most of history, Iranian Jews experienced a considerable amount of, civic inclusion and also prosperity. And at its peak, Iran had one of the largest Jewish populations in all the Middle East. So Persians and Jews historically had good relationships. They coexisted, and even the Jewish population in Iran now they're not persecuted or anything like that. It's not huge, but
they have 30,000 or something like that.
It's very minor.
Yeah. Considering they have like 90 million people.
I'm sure there's more Persian Jews in the United States than there is in Iran.
Yeah, very likely.
By far.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably more Persian Jews in Great Neck, New York than in Iran.
Very likely. Yeah.
So what changed?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, really. And the short version is that because international power struggles, and the one in particular, centered around Palestine in the 20th century, and, Jewish identity changed from a religious communal category into more of a geopolitical one. And that, I think that shift, it forced Tehran to separate from, its longstanding internal relationships with the Jewish populations that lived among them. And it shifted away from them to, their external position on Palestine, and later, the question of Israel. And, after the First World War, obviously ruled Palestine under the League of Nations mandate, and Jewish immigration accelerated under that mandate, under the British protection. And obviously that was driven by, the Zionist project. But, while the Arab majority was, rejecting a Jewish state, it was still under the control of the British. So that's the scenario that we see ourselves in after the First World War. And that obviously created a lot of violence between both parties, but also, interestingly, against the British themselves, right? So there was a lot of violence from Palestinians against British, and even Jewish people against the British. And after the Second World War, London had this, basically they handed the problem over to the United Nations after that was created. And in 1947, Iran joined the UN Special Committee on Palestine, and they officially opposed the partition. They warned that it would produce like lasting violence, and Tehran advocated for basically just a single state, a federal state, basically. The UN did the partition plan anyway, and we all know what happens next. But fighting immediately started. Israel declared its independence. Iran voted against the partition, and they refused to formally recognize Israel at the time. And this is a position that the Shah maintained throughout his reign. But early on in the creation of Israel, when that was first spun up, there was some advantages for Iran. Israel, that is, was an advantage to Iran, but it was kind of a double-edged sword. And on one hand, it's this non-Arab, pro-Western that could absorb a lot of the Arab hostilities, might have been directed towards Iran, thus would benefit Iran's security apparatus. But at the same time, if they supported Israel, then open support for Israel would also make Arab anger redirect towards Iran. So it was kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation about, Israel, and Iran supporting Israel. And so as a direct result of that, I think that the Shah chose to be ambiguous about whether or not they directly supported Israel. So there's a little bit of a back and forth, some gray area around it, and certainly some stuff covertly happening in the background that just existed.
Well, just to provide some background, because it gets confusing regarding who was actually in power in Iran. So when Israel declared independence in 1948, Iran was formerly ruled by the Shah, who had been on the throne since 1941. But his authority was not absolute yet. The monarchy existed, but it wasn't an authoritarian government yet. Mohammad Mossadegh, he entered office in 1951, and he was elected prime minister. The Shah took power after the 1953 coup. And then from that point forward, foreign policy was set by him. Yet on Israel, there was a lot of consistency between the previous governments, because they didn't want to create an alliance with Israel, or they didn't want to become enemies with them either, because Iran viewed the Soviet Union as the primary threat, because there was a long history of Russia basically using Persia as their playground. Also, Moscow would back Iranian leftist movements during the Cold War. Now, Israel initially appeared unreliable due to its socialist sympathies when the state was first created. But as Israel aligned more clearly with the West, Iran shifted to de facto acceptance, but without granting them formal diplomatic recognition.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Israel adopted a strategy of aligning with non-Arab powers. This was called the periphery doctrine. So Israel would create these working relationships with countries like Turkey, in Ethiopia, and Iran was included in that.
Right. And at the same time, Iran's relationship with the Arab regimes was super bad as well. Like in the 1950s, there was this idea of pan-Arabism under Egypt's Nasser, for which Persians weren't included, right? And that threatened Iranian interests. So, especially the territorial claims around Iran's like oil-rich southwestern region. And that was a real concern because, this is what the Iran and Iraq war was fought over in the 80s. So in the 50s, Iran and Israel, they started sharing intelligence. And this is what, basically what followed was the economic and military cooperation. For example, after the Suez crisis, Iran financed a pipeline, and that allowed Iranian oil to bypass the Suez Canal. And that was called, if I remember correctly, I wrote this down, the Elliott to Ashkelon pipeline. And this is actually super interesting. I was reading about this. Recently, Netanyahu came out on one of these press conferences, and the reporter asked him, like, hey, what's the exit strategy? Well, how do we make this safer? How do we make the scenario safer? And his response was, and I'll try and put the video.
I think that what has to be done is to have alternative routes. Instead of going through the choke points of the Hormuz Straits and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, in order to have the flow of oil, just have oil pipelines going west through the Arabian Peninsula, right up to Israel, right up to our Mediterranean ports, and you've just done away with the choke points for forever.
But the response was something to the tune of, we want to make sure that we don't have over-reliance on the Strait of Hormuz, for shipping oil. So what we should do is we should build a pipeline straight from, Saudi Arabia through the Arabian Peninsula, through Jordan, or right up to, Haifa, and, just export the oil directly from there. So there's like this precedent actually for Israel to like be partnered with regional people when it suits them, specifically around the flow of oil, because it suits them naturally. I mean, if you know what, I'm going to pull up this map because I think this is worth looking at. Got a little scribbly guy there. All right. Can you see this map, Henry?
Nothing like a good map.
I love maps. Okay. So obviously this is Iran, this big old chunk right here. And
this
most
is Iran right here.
I'm gonna talk through this
country,
for the people.
This country is Iran. The one that's
this is Iran.
The
For
one
those who
with
didn't
the
know, let
big
me zoom
lake
out.
on it.
Look, this is where it is in the world, right? So, shit, why did I do that?
So wait. I have important observation about Iran we need to make. Those like kind of squiggly lines right there. Those are really big hills.
Yeah, giant mountains.
They're mountains. There's ski resorts there somewhere. Up near Tehran, there's a ski resort. I can show it to you. It's a nice ski resort. It's somewhere over there.
Somewhere in this general area.
There's a lot of mountains.
And it's
then
literally one big ass
also
mountain range.
There's deserts. And then there's forests as well.
Yep. A couple of green spots. Yep.
So its neighbor though, Iraq.
Flat.
Here's the difference between Iraq and Iran. Iraq does not have mountains, and they don't have forests. Most of it is kind of like Arizona, or something like that. Whatever the term is,
flat and dusty.
Because the mountains, they actually steal the precipitation that's supposed to go into Iraq.
Yep, they block
Iran, so it becomes a desert.
That is true.
So
that wasn't the
things that we need to.
That wasn't the important part though. But so most of the oil, right? The oil is, and I'm going to make a different color because I feel like it. The oil is in this section right here. Most of it, at least. Oil's right here. Most of it is centered in this area right here. This is where your oil goes. Now, if you want to get the oil out and go to like Europe, which is like a huge buyer, right? You could sail it all the way the hell around. We can go around Africa and then go this way. But that's crazy, right? Because that takes a hella long time and that's very expensive. And so what they did was eventually they created the Suez Canal. So now you can go up this way and you can go through this little Egypt. Basically, Egypt unilaterally decided to cut Africa off from the rest of this other, the Asian continent. So you can go this way. But, in the 50s, when we were talking about Iran and Israel cooperating on this pipeline, they were like, well, we don't want everything to go through the Suez Canal, partly because of the geopolitical issue, right? Cairo, they are all about this, pan-Arabism thing, and that threatens both the Israelis and the Persians because they're not included in that in-group, right? And so at any point, if there's like an issue geopolitically, they could just shut down the strait right here. They can shut down this, canal, and well, there you go. That's it. No more oil goes through. And that's heavily important for the, specifically for the Iranians, but, also geopolitically for the Israelis. So what Israel said, they go and say, hey, Iran, how about instead of going through the Gulf of Suez, you come up here through the Gulf of Aqaba, or whatever the hell that's called, and you come up right to the little tippy tip of Israel, right here in this point of water called Eli. And then we build a pipeline through all of Israel, and we end it at Ashkelon, and I'll draw that for you. We go from here all the way up to here, and then from there we can go on to the sea and go on to Europe. And that was a profitable idea because now we have an alternative. We can avoid our geopolitical partner or frenemy in Egypt, and we can make this thing. We can make this a thing. Iran, you get a new shipping pipeline, and Israel, they make a hell of a lot of money because they get to control the oil flow and they levy taxes for, transit of oil. It's a win-win situation, right? But this is something that happens in the background. They actually set up like a company that's like a shadowy company, but it's obviously out in the open because they have to create it. And like neither party is admitting to the fact that like, yeah, we're doing this in partnership, like Iran and Israel. So they make this like shell company to spin up this idea, But really it's being supported by both the governments of Israel and the governments of Iran, though, is a different issue, right? So we'll go to a new color. Now, as I said before, here's your oil-rich area, and a lot of this is like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, all those UAE. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is closed off, right? Iran effectively put mines in there, and they're, holding that ransom. So it's kind of like the thing that they were afraid of Egypt doing back in the 50s. So now Israel's saying, well, hell, how about you just make a pipeline all through this chunk of land straight into Israel? And then we can send it out through that way. I mean, it makes sense. Like from a logical perspective, this makes sense. Like just put a pipeline right here, and now you don't have to use the waterway. But it's not as efficient. It's not as efficient as oil tankers for a couple of reasons, right? You have to have miles and miles and miles of pipeline, and that has to be maintained all the time. Every couple hundred miles, if you want to pump oil that far, you need a pumping station. Those pumping stations are vulnerable to attack. We've already seen Iran attack pumping stations, and same thing with the Houthis in Yemen. They've attacked Saudi Arabian east-west pipeline pumping stations and turned those offline during their conflict. And just generally speaking, a pipeline is static, whereas a ship is moving, so you can move it around a lot easier. Tanker can carry a whole lot of oil, so economically speaking, this isn't necessarily the cheapest way to do it, though it is a way to avoid, this Strait of Hormuz problem, which is just go ahead and don't go through this waterway. You know what I mean? It's an interesting idea, but I think I'll let you guys infer what you want to infer about, Israel's, their end of this bargain. They stand only to benefit.
I mean, a lot of the geopolitics in the Middle East has to do is pipeline politics. It's like, where is this pipeline starting from and what countries does it transit? Because, for every single country the pipeline transits through, then that's revenue for the country,
Right. They collect the tax. Mm-hmm.
So Middle Eastern politics is obviously completely shaped by oil. It's like, it's 100% oil, basically. Everything, all the issues surround oil. The current conflict right now, you're looking at if you bring the map up right now, not to diverge too much. Bring the map. Can you bring the reason why the Strait of Hormuz closing is such a big deal? Because you could be like, because Saudi has another pipeline that goes to the Red Sea. However,
East-west.
the problem is that the Red Sea is not as deep as the Strait of Hormuz, so that you can't get as big of tankers in there.
That's right. That's right. So basically,
Also,
what they're doing is they have a go from over here to over here, right, and then get off in the Red Sea. But as you said, the Red Sea, this isn't deep enough for the largest of the tankers to go through, and then they still have to transit downwards this way if they want to go out to like Asia. And then what's the big issue right here? Well, the proxy of Iran is the Houthis in Yemen right here. And so they've already shown the ability to, harass shipping going through this particular strait, the Bab el Mandeb Strait.
so furthermore, it's in the world's interest for there not to be a war going on in the Gulf because of these two straits. And right now there is. And but we were not going to cover the current conflict, but
sorry, it was relevant because like
the context is necessary.
Yeah, because we're talking about the past, and we're talking about it, in particular the cooperation between Iran and Israel historically, and there was quite a bit of cooperation specifically around pipelines in the 1950s, and this was kind of covert. And it seems like history doesn't rhyme. It doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. Like this sounds a hell of a lot like the 1950s in that respect. And so in the 1950s specifically, and I'll stop sharing here, in the 1950s specifically, Israel needed to have a good relationship with Iran because Iran is on the outer edge of the Arab world, right? Now, Iran could not openly ally with Israel, so they basically placed their official relationships under covert pretenses, so under Savak, which is Iran's intelligence bureau and their secret police, rather than putting it through their foreign ministry. So instead of doing like State Department, they decided to put it under the CIA, is the analog here, right? And Israel, periodically was pressing for public recognition, but, obviously hoping to normalize its place in the region. But, the Shah throughout basically refused that.
Well, I mean, the Shah had to refuse because even though they were at odds with the Arab nations or the Arab nationalists, they were still trying to have good relations with the Gulf monarchies. Because remember, the Gulf monarchies were enemies of the Arab nationalists. It was what Malcolm Kerr called the Arab Cold War. Because now when you say the Arab Cold War, in like today's context, you're talking about the rift between Sunnis and Shias.
Right.
The rift between Sunnis and Shias, like historically, there were times obviously that they fought, but in the early 20th century, there wasn't that much hostility. Like that was kind of an old world thing. When they talk about the Arab Cold War, they're talking about the Arab nationalists versus the monarchist.
That's right. Yeah. And in the 1960s, the Shah, made a public remark that acknowledges, Iran's official recognition of Israel. And this had like this huge ripple effect in the Arab world. And Nasser responded by basically severing diplomatic relationships with Iran in 1960. And then Egypt framed this like relationship with Iran and Israel as like basically proof that Tehran was acting as like a Western or a Zionist proxy, which is just kind of funny, historically speaking. But it let Cairo justify more, active Egyptian role in Gulf affairs, basically. Give him an in.
Well, you have to remember too is that like Egypt was actually a powerful country back then.
Super.
I mean, it could be a powerful country now. It has a really big population, but back in the day, it had a very large military. It had infrastructure that was built by the British. For example, like Egypt they were able to project power across the region. They were able to deploy forces in North Yemen during the Civil War. At its peak, it had thousands of troops in Yemen, supported by air power and naval assets that were operating out of the Red Sea, which, again, that wasn't in Tehran's interest. Like they didn't want, Egyptian naval assets in their waters, or in the Red Sea,
or even anywhere near it.
Yeah. because it gave Egypt power over oil shipping routes in the Persian Gulf. And to put this into perspective for Iran, the Arabs were an annoyance or competitors or whatever you want to call them, but they were people that they had to engage with if they wanted to expand their power. For Israel, the Arabs were existential threats. So there was a difference between like the threat level between the two. Like Iran
the motivation
had to deal with them. They were like, all right, like these are people we have to deal with. For Israel, that was like, okay, we're at war with these people. So in the 50s and 60s, there was much more parity between the Israelis and their enemies. So it wasn't like now where the Israelis
Israel
are just
dominance.
where Israel, frankly dominates all of its neighbors.
Yeah, they can attack with impunity.
In the 50s and 60s and early 70s, it was a much more even playing field. There was no guarantee that Israel was going to win those wars that they did. In fact, a lot of people thought they would lose them. So because of that, the Israelis felt like they needed Iran more than Iran needed Israel, which was probably true. That being said, after Israel defeats the Arab nationalists in 1967, Israel is no longer a besieged state. They're an emerging or even dominant or the dominant military power. And at the same time, Iran is experiencing a lot of economic growth and rising regional influence. The British left their colonies. They had colonies in Bahrain and in Qatar. When they left, that created a really big opening for the Iranians. So the thinking now from Tehran is that Israel could be a regional competitor. So in the Shah's view, he wanted Israel to be what it was like in the 60s. He wanted it to exist and be, stable enough to withstand the Arab regimes and also the Soviet Union, but not so strong where they could, A, be a dominant power, and B, be so strong that they completely dominated the Arabs. The Shah did, he didn't fear the Israelis as a direct threat, but he wanted to make sure that there was no imbalance in their favor.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's refusal to give up occupied Arab territories basically created more issues. Rather than moving closer to Israel after its victory, the Shah basically stopped all the joint projects that they had kind of covertly and started publicly condemning them. And, not the death to Israel stuff that you hear from the mullahs or anything like that, but, criticizing them under the guise of an international law, as an example. So Iran, they backed the UN Security Council Resolution 242, and they pressured Israel privately and through Washington to basically withdraw from the occupied territories. And if I'm not, 242 was the one where that said that Zionism was a form of racism, or no, that was 3379, right? 242 was the going back to pre-67 borders, right? Yeah. So that was the after the aftermath of the 6-Day War. 242 basically was the land for peace formula on two central states. So one was to withdraw the Israeli armed forces from the territories from that 67 conflict, and then the second part of that was to basically stop the belligerency and respect each other's sovereignty. And the controversial part about this was a single word. It was Israel and the U.S. were arguing around the text, and the text in English suggested a withdrawal from territories, whereas the French version of the same text said the territories, which would, one of them, without the implied like a partial withdrawal, and the one with the implied a full withdrawal. And basically on the strength of a single word being omitted from the English version, the Israelis in the U.S. basically, they're making arguments about, actually it didn't mean full withdrawal, it just meant some withdrawal, which is interesting. But getting down a rabbit hole, from Tehran's perspective, this occupation it was unresolved, and it didn't strengthen Israel in any way that benefited Iran, and it just basically locked the region into a permanent like cycle of violence that could possibly threaten to spill into the Persian Gulf. And like here we are decades later, and it actually has.
Also, Tehran was aware that legitimizing conquest anywhere in the region would set the precedent that could later be used against Iran itself.
Yep.
Because Iran is a mixed state ethnically.
Yeah.
They have borderlands where they just didn't want to open up that can of worms.
Yeah, they have a lot of Azeris and
Baluchistanis.
Baluchistanis.
Mm-hmm. So now Iran used this criticism to open the door for improved relations with the Arab states. And after that, Egypt and Iran started to warm up with each other. The Shah, he tried to get Israel to compromise with Cairo. The argument was that detaching Egypt from the Soviet Union mattered a lot more than Israel's territorial gains. Now, as Egypt receded as a threat, Iraq starts to rise as a threat. The Arab regimes, Egypt and Syria, they tossed the Soviets out in the early 70s. They start aligning more with the West. However, Baghdad, they further align with Moscow, which is obviously much more of a problem for Iran than Egypt, as we see, years later.
Right.
Israel shared this concern. So this emerging threat preserved the rationale for continued clandestine cooperation, even as political relations were continuing to go down.
Can we pull this back to the Yom Kippur War? Like, what was Iran's policy then?
Iran wanted neither an Arab victory or an Israeli victory, because a decisive win by either side would threaten Iran's trajectory towards ultimately primacy in the Middle East. The Shah had grand plans. He was a big thinker. Like, he wanted Iran to be the dominant power in the entire region. I think Iranians in general, a lot of them still hold that view.
Yeah.
But a prolonged war risks drawing the superpowers back into the Persian Gulf, which would undermine Iran's claim to regional leadership. Mm-hmm. Tehran, therefore, they remained neutral. But during the war, Iran still supplied oil and logistical support to Arab states. But at the same time, Iran refused to join the Arab oil embargo and continued selling oil and weapons to Israel. Despite this, many in Israel still viewed that as a betrayal.
I mean, the decisive break, I think, came over Iraq and the Kurds. For years. Iran and Israel had been jointly supported the Kurdish rebellion in northern Iraq to weaken Baghdad. But in 1975, the Shah basically changed policies on that. And without consulting Israel or the United States, he signed like an agreement with Saddam Hussein that settled a couple of border disputes in Iran's favor if he stopped supporting the Kurds. And Saddam then crushed the Kurds so quickly that Israeli operatives that were embedded in Iraq, they barely had enough time to like escape from that, which is kind of a wild story for another time maybe. But I think the trend that you're seeing is that as Iran becomes more and more powerful, the less that they start care about Israel, and they only really care about them when they need to, when they need them, and they only really need them less and less. And because Iran is at the time on its way to becoming like a great power, they see themselves as like this continuation of the great Persian Empire, right? The U.S. needs Iran more than the U.S. needs Israelis at that point. And Israel was useful for intelligence and technology, and but it also kind of became a liability for Tehran, especially in the regional positioning, and it became a bit of a domestic, irritant for Iran.
Yeah, and it's a really important point. The relationship, one of the reasons why the United States and the Iranians have such a bad relationship today is because of like the betrayal. Because we really thought Iran was like our key partner back in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
they were a lot more important than the Israelis for U.S. policy objections, because Iran is a much bigger country, has a much bigger population. It
more resources.
covers more important strategic points. It's closer to the Soviet Union, so it's why the U.S. just felt so betrayed. But going back, in Israel, the relationship between the relationship with Iran had broad public support. In Iran, the public sentiment was vastly against Israel. Everyone hated them because Israel was a very aggressive state who conquered its neighbors. So most of the world hated them. Now, anti-Israeli agitation provided a safer outlet for anger in a system where criticizing the Shah would put you in jail. So, that became kind of like a pressure release for the population. And you see that across the Middle East today. People don't really, the government's not going to crack down. If people are really unhappy in like Egypt or something, or in Turkey, or even one of the Gulf monarchies, and they start protesting Israel, start burning Israeli flags, like they're not going to be arrested. But if they criticize their governments, they will be.
Burn their own flags, then it's a different story. Yeah. It's easy. They're a straw man. They're the thing that they can use to blame all of the issues on. Rightfully so in some cases, but
rightfully so in many cases, but probably maybe unrightfully so in some cases. Now, hostility obviously existed within the Iranian state as well. Basically, there was like a split. Like the foreign ministry did not like Israel because they had to deal with the diplomatic price across the non-aligned Arab world. They had to deal with like the consequences of dealing with Israel. However, the military and the secret police, they wanted they were more pragmatic, and they favored keeping the Israeli ties strong. Something important to note: the Shah was very concerned about Jewish influence in the United States. He feared that antagonizing Israel would like bring the American media political machine down against him. But he would, there's interviews and there's of him talking about that, like, the U.S. is Zionist occupied and all that. But to pull this back, in 1975, Iran voted for General Assembly Resolution 3379. And that's the one that equated Zionism with racism. And the reason why Iran voted for this is that they were trying to align themselves with the broader developing world bloc at the UN, the non-aligned movement. And it was partly an appeal to the anti-colonial settlement in what we call the Global South, where Zionism was framed as a settler colonial project. And the reason why they were doing that is they were trying to project regional power even outside the Middle East
and sell them oil. And actually, interestingly, the Resolution 3379, that one is one of the, I think, one of two of the only General Assembly resolutions that were like rescinded. In like 1991, they did a second vote to get rid of that resolution, and the reason why they did that was because they wanted to. Israel was saying that they didn't want to join the peace conference in Madrid at the time in the early 90s, and the only way that they were going to go to it is if everyone voted to get rid of the 3379, which said that Zionism was racist. And so they got what they wanted. The Israelis, they voted to get rid of 3379. That went away. They went to the meeting. PLO wasn't allowed to go, but they had some proxies, some residents of the West Bank got to go. And talks were somewhat productive, actually. But in the end, nothing really happened. There weren't any settlement freezes or any negotiated settlements on a path for peace, so didn't really go anywhere. But 3379 went away. With a side note, though, Let's talk about the 77 elections in Israel instead. In June of 77, the Israeli right won, like a marked shift, rather than like just a simple turnover. They won by a landslide, and Likud basically rose to power at this point under Menachem Begin, and Israel moved away from the labor's like pragmatic security first approach to like what I'd probably describe as an overly ideological conception of the state. And Begin, who was shaped by revisionist Zionism and hardened by the fact that he was in exile for a while, he treated Israel and its land like not like a negotiable like security buffer, but like as a historical and like moral inheritance. This is where you get like this idea of like, no, God promised me this land. This is ours, right? We're not negotiating away the land that is ours. This wasn't like the practice of pre-Likud. Pre-Likud, the Israeli government was more flexible and more willing to make negotiated settlements, for geopolitical reasons around its land. Land was just like a bargaining chip.
They were secular.
Exactly.
They were extremist in many cases, but they were secular nationalists.
That's right. And at this time, the West Bank was renamed to Judea and Samaria. It wasn't a bargaining chip anymore, but it was like an integral component of the national identity of the state of Israel. And settlements just became a stalemate. Like it wasn't something to use for negotiation at all anymore. And that shift really carried some profound strategic consequences. Likud basically elevated what people would call like this real school, arguing that like Jewish sovereignty was strengthened by territorial expansion, even at the cost of absorbing like a large Palestinian population. And labor in Israel, their rival, sociological logic, it basically warned that like annexation would eventually dissolve Israel's Jewish character through demographics, right? So the Labor Party was like saying, hey, you can't just expand, even if you had this like ideological idea of the state of Israel or greater Israel, because what you're going to do, practically speaking, is absorb all of these Palestinian Arabs within your borders, right?
Yeah, and the 80-20 rule. Like they wanted to make sure that like, listen, like we have a good thing going right here. Jews are 80% of the population here. Like the more we expand, the more Arabs we're going to have to absorb. We're going to lose the super majority.
Exactly. And through demographic shifts, that's going to make them lose their grip on it. So you can't spread yourself too thin, so to speak, right? But Likud come in and says like, well, fuck that. No, we must expand. This is our territory. From a ideological, theological perspective. It's a pretty big break, and Begin's government paired that worldview with a new security doctrine, and it rejected, just deterrence in favor of like just regional dominance. They wanted Israel to be a military hegemon rather than, just like the state that's constantly under threat by its neighbors and looking for help and looking to accommodate themselves in the neighborhood. Now they wanted to be the big dog, which is an interesting shift.
Well, the Iranians did not like this. So, Tehran had been cooperating with Israel, but essentially this was something that caused them to move closer to the Arabs and also withdraw under UN resolutions. They were like, okay, we need to solve the Palestinian question. But again, this did not completely break ties between Israel and Iran, but cooperation became much more conditional.
Yeah.
And you can see the trend here. Like they are the relationship is gradually deteriorating over time.
Yeah, it's definitely eroding. We can jump ahead a little bit. Like, so we can go to 79. And that's when the monarchy collapsed in Iran, and the Islamic regime took power. And after the Shah's departure, there was no effective authority at the time. And Khomeini, he came up and basically displaced, the transitional government that was set up. Israel did attempt to preserve the minimal amount of ties that it had with Iran prior to the collapse, but that definitely failed. And then the new government that was set up, formally severed those relationships. That partnership ended and it was over.
Yeah. So there was hostility to Israel all across the Revolutionary Coalition. And the Revolutionary Coalition was like, there were different factions of it. It wasn't just all, just like religious fanatics or whatever you want to call them. There was a left-wing component to that as well. And the left framed Israel as this like American proxy. And the clerical bloc, they treated the opposition as a religious obligation. They were kind of an enemy to Islam. Thus, after the revolution, the PLO tried to start working with the new revolutionary regime. And to make a long story short, it never actually really worked out.
Yeah.
And for various reasons that we're not going to get into today, but the Iranian support for the PLO was almost entirely rhetorical.
Lip service, basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they never cooperated really with the PLO in any significant way, nor have they really cooperated that much with any Palestinian movement, with the exception of maybe Hamas, which is really not totally clear how their involvement with Hamas is. There's
money being exchanged, perhaps, but that's about it.
There's not like widespread military support, that unless there's something that we don't know about. But most Hamas weapons are built and most of their money is actually from just charity organizations.
Right.
It's from.
They also smuggle in a good amount through Egypt, but again, that's not necessarily a particularly friendly country with Iran. So,
but also another reason is that Iran was declining militarily. They didn't really have support to give at this time.
Mm-hmm.
The regime was previously, they were pursuing this position of dominance in the region. They weren't really able to do this in the late after the revolutionary regime took over. So they started to, they pursued regional leadership through political Islam. So they replaced the Shah's model of power projection with this ideological one.
Yeah. I mean, you think this is where like the relationship would turn bad? Like, what is it today?
I mean, no, despite ideological hostility, both sides maintained discrete contacts. So Israel supplied equipment and spare part direct channels. Iranian leadership accepted this when necessary because they still actually needed each other. Because after the revolution, there still is an enemy that they share, and that common enemy is Iraq.
Yeah, that's right. And Iran was isolated from the United States at this time. They were isolated from the Arab states. They were isolated from the Soviet Union, and the Shah's oil wealth and like diplomatic machinery was basically gone at this point. So Iran, jumped into the early 80s pretty weak and, strategically vulnerable. Saddam Hussein basically got the idea that Iran was fractured militarily and had a lot of internal chaos, and they were like super unpopular in the region. And because Saddam was backed by the Gulf monarchies, and he was also kind of favored by Washington and Moscow, Iraq decided in 1980 to invade. And, his idea was to seize the, what's this called? The Shah and the oil-rich province of Khuzestan. I had to read that one off because hard to remember. But basically, take over some oil-rich areas and basically to establish himself as the dominant Gulf power. What was expected as a quick victory from Iraq turned into a brutal 8-year war. One of the most brutal wars in modern history. And, Iranian society basically rallied behind the flag on this one. And they absorbed a just incredibly high amount of losses. Nevertheless, they successfully halted the Iraqi advance. And the war deepened Iran's isolation from, its regional neighbors, while also forcing the revolutionary state to have some pressure. And they're surrounded by, like I said before, hostile Arab governments. All the superpowers in the world don't really care about them. So they started shifting away from early revolutionary like death to Israel kind of stuff, and they moved towards kind of a more pragmatic approach, survival approach. And this kind of created a dual strategy that defines Iranian policy for the next several decades. Kind of the ability to have this rhetoric that's extremely hostile on the outside towards Israel, and to, make friends with the Arabs that are in the region. But that's also this discrete kind of backdoor deals and cooperation with both Israel and Washington, to sustain the war effort in this case during the Iran-Iraq war, but also just broadly to sustain themselves moving beyond that. And so there's this like tension, right? There's this tension between this outwards ideology that they have and then this, internal, desire to stay alive. So we kind of said this already, but this anti-Israeli rhetoric, it just it becomes a political instrument rather than like a strategy. It was used specifically to avoid a direct confrontation while also serving Iran's ambition to lead the Islamic world, which is pretty interesting. And the result of this is like a very nuanced, very layered, sometimes very contradictory foreign policy that publicly was this absolutist, but privately it's very transactional with Israel, and it's less by like this romantic idea of like the revolution and more just by doing the math. They needed regional partners at the time, and Israel supported them covertly, which is a huge part of the reason why they weren't just totally steamrolled over by Iraq when Saddam invaded.
Well, it's so the revolutionary government is essentially keeping the same foreign policy as Iran, but they're just taking things to a greater level in terms of rhetoric. But the difference is that now this is a transnational revolutionary regime. Like, it's something that you can export. Like, you cannot export Persian nationalism to Iraq, or you cannot export Persian nationalism to Lebanon. What you can export to other countries is the ideological of the religious fundamentalism or the revolutionary spirit of the regime. And it was Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 that ended up giving Iran its clearest opportunity to project power into the Arab world.
Yeah.
Southern Lebanon, specifically their Shia population, before the war or during the early part of the war, they actually saw the Israelis as a positive counterweight to the PLO, because the PLO was very heavy-handed in Lebanon. But the behavior of the Israelis, the brutal behavior of the Israelis in southern Lebanon, obviously turned the Shia population against them. And this brutality of the war, it radicalized the environment. And it made, because the Lebanon war was awful, like massacres, and it was very ugly. The southern Shia population gets radicalized, and the environment made Tehran's message very attractive to the Shia communities, who were largely the poor, impoverished, and they needed patrons.
It always is. Yeah.
and Iran seized the opening. So Hezbollah gave Iran this foothold on Israel's northern flank. And at the same time, the Iran-Iraq war was settling into a stalemate. Israel viewed this as essentially like, they wanted it to be a stalemate. Like they didn't want Iraq to win. So it maintained limited contact with Iran while essentially waiting for Khamenei to die. They thought whoever the new leadership would be more willing to work with the West. However, U.S. policy was different. Washington increased support for Iraq and attempted to, restrict Iran's access to arms, while Israel continued to indirectly arm Iran. This obviously is what produces the conditions for Iran-Contra,
Right.
because Iran had all these F-15s and shit that were given to them from the Nixon administration, and they needed the spare parts to fix them.
Right.
So
Mhm.
Iran needed access to arms from Washington. At the same time, the United States, they were trying to get, they sought hostage releases, and they had to get some trades too. So Israel sought to draw Iran back toward a strategic alignment. They try to use this as a way to
Bring them
draw
back into
Iran
the fold.
Yeah.
Mhm. So in the late 80s, the Israelis believed that the worst outcome of the Iran-Iraq war was, an Iraqi victory, especially since the U.S. was working so closely with them. Yet Israel kept clinging to, the idea that revolutionary Iran was just like a temporary detour, and that the real Iran was going to come back and, it was going to be a non-Arab partner again. And, as soon as Khomeini died, that was just going to be the end of that little phase. It was like my goth phase in high school, a couple of years and then we're going to be out, but it always kept channels open to communicate with Iran, even after the Iran-Contra scandal. And even when those channels were empowering Iranian hardliners, they kept them open because they really did hope that Iran would come back to their senses, so to speak, and like start cooperating with them again.
So I think what happened is that the Iranians were dangling promises to the Israelis in exchange for spare parts.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, the Israelis kind of misread the intentions of Iran. So, like, the senior Israelis would say things like, like you said, like Iran was this long-term friend in waiting, and after Khomeini's regime would pass, they would turn back into the type of government they were before.
Yeah.
But take in mind, there were split views within Israel as well, like any other country. There was a camp that thought that the total destruction of the war would lead to the Iranians being forced to renew ties with Israel. But others were very concerned about Hezbollah as proof that, Iran was not moving back towards Israel. Because in the 80s, like, Hezbollah becomes a much bigger threat later on in like the 2000s. So it was obviously on their radar, but it wasn't as big of a threat as it turned out to be, even like right now. But Israeli officials were obviously concerned about that. There were Israeli officials that even floated the idea of leaning on Iraq as a counterweight to Iranian fundamentalism. And, that would have been something that would have been heresy a few years earlier.
Yeah.
Still, a large part of the Israeli establishment, they were really just kind of banking on Khamenei's death, and that would open up the country.
Yeah.
Now, after Khamenei dies in 1989, Israel tested whether there would be a shift in their policy. So, they had contacts, and I think the Israelis initially saw that as like a possible renewed alignment, while Iran was essentially using them to relieve economic pressure and just still maintain that indirect access to Washington. Inside Iran, the leadership was also split between those favoring really armament and those who were focused on really reconstruction and reducing their political isolation. So the same policy it goes on. Public rhetoric stayed hostile. However, the policy was pragmatic in some cases, including outreach to the Gulf states. Iran also signaled openness through Lebanon, because they were also like helping get hostages out and things like that. Now, let me point something out. Everything changes in the Middle East in the 90s. In the early 90s, two important things happen. Iraq is just, essentially smashed in the Gulf War, and the Soviet Union collapses.
Yeah.
So the circumstances that lead Iran and Israel to cooperate are gone. Now, both states benefit in terms of like raw security terms, but the vacuum made them much more competitive. Israel began to see a post-Iraq, post-Soviet Union Iran as this unbalanced power that could dominate the Gulf. And Iran saw this rare opening to climb out of isolation and reclaim primacy. So during the Gulf War, Iran secretly cooperated with the United States. They allowed the U.S. to use their airspace and help, and also refuse to inflame the post-war Shia uprising in Iraq in ways that might dissolve the Iraqi state. However, there were still problems.
Yeah, and some context to that is that the kind of the psychological aspect of the 1980s war and Saddam's survival kept Iranian planning basically focused on like a rematch. Like Iran was planning to go again with these fears that the next time that they would be using weapons of mass destruction, that could appear early. And so Iran starts work on missiles, and it intensified as this kind of response to the Scud vulnerability that they exposed in the prior war. Israeli services they tracked a growing long range missile effort in the mid 1990s, and that included the development of the Shahab 3 that was derived from North Korean technology. And that's a system that could eventually reach Israel, which is interesting. And Tehran insisted that it was just a deterrent infrastructure rather than an offensive plan. Iran also restarted part of its nuclear energy program, which was initially super far from making weapons or anything like that. And later they invite international inspections, and it becomes a little bit more ambiguous than a clear verdict that they would be developing a nuclear weapon. But they were playing by the rules for the most part. And within this context, Israel sees as now becoming the primary danger because of the two things that I mentioned. They develop these longish, medium to long range ballistic missiles that can reach Israel, and they start developing their nuclear energy program, albeit get peaceful, and for energy purposes and not for weapons. But you kind of extrapolate from the two, you put two and two together, and you're saying, they might actually be looking to hit us. And so, as a result, within that context, working with Iran was seen as like a political constraint, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, where Iran, was monitoring Israeli activity in some of these newly independent states after the Soviet Union had fell. And then, they start reducing military spending. They emphasized economic recovery at the time, and they moved to normalize relations with the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia. And the objective there was basically to position Iran as a central regional actor, without relying on the external great powers, or power singular, because one of them had just fallen, right? And Tehran expected this shift to be accepted by Washington. But the U.S. obviously chose to reinforce its security ties with the Gulf partners instead. And this preserved the U.S. dominance in the region, and it kept Iran excluded. It limited the scope of their regional claims or aspirations.
I actually think this might be a good time to end this episode. What do you think?
I think so too.
Because we can go on. I think we kind of laid out like the history. Well, there's so much more we can get into over like the Oslo Accords and really like the turn, like the actual turn during the Rabin policy. But we've already been going for an hour and a half. And
it's not even that. I think at this point in what we've said so far, we've already solidified that Iran and Israel have a transactional relationship that stretches back decades and decades and decades, hundreds of years even, thousands really, if you want to look at it. But more specifically in the modern time, I think we've kind of demonstrated how they had a relationship of convenience and how that convenience has slowly eroded over time. And by the point where, we're at the early 90s, after the Iran-Iraq war and after the fall of the Soviet Union, at this point, we're on completely diverged paths. But even though they're on completely diverged paths, there's still these kind of covert, one-off, cooperations that feel super contradictory to, what you see in the rhetoric. And that's not new. That is actually, it rhymes with all of the things that we've seen, in the early 20th century. Is that a good way to wrap that up?
Yeah, I'll just say that something that's important is that when you look at Israeli policy is that there are different camps within Israeli policy during this time. One camp sees that Iran is a much greater threat. The other camp still sees Iraq as a much greater threat because Iraq still existed and they were actively providing much more material support to the Palestinians than Iran was. So there was a debate of like, okay, like what are we going to do right now? Like who should we prioritize? If we can get the U.S. to conquer one of them, which one should we do? And basically, like the Netanyahu camp was like, no, we need to take out Iraq. And
you say thus in Hebrew,
and then the Sharon camp was more hawkish on Iran.
Yeah,
and it's funny now because you say Netanyahu was more hawkish than someone else, but
yeah,
there's obviously a whole history that goes into it, and maybe we can elaborate more if you want to hear more about this. But I think this is a good time to stop this episode. Anything else that you want to talk about?
Oh man, I mean, basically there's a giant elephant in the room about whether or not we're going to be putting boots on the ground in Iran, and it's something that we started talking about kind of off the record before the episode started, and we're talking about this particular topic because I think it's helpful context that I don't think a lot of people are talking about right now, and I think it puts the current conflict into perspective. But man, it is a weird time to be alive. This is a strange timeline we live on. Very strange.
It sure is. And I'm just checking my phone to see that
to see what blew up.
See if it happened yet, because I figured that I think most people have a 3 or even 4 day weekend, so it might be a good time to do it.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you for listening to another episode of Bro History. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, our podcast on your favorite podcast app. You can also follow us on Substack. Danny, anything else?
And if you want to chat with us, you can engage with us in the comment section of either YouTube's or Spotify. Let us know. We're happy to chat with you.
Right. Peace, guys.
Peace.